Hi, gang. Welcome to week number 4 of 6. And that 6 also includes finals. So that means we're in the penultimate week of the semester, the second to last week. So congrats. Good job. I'm really proud of you for what you've been able to do so far and the way you've been showing up in this class. So really great job. So in order for us to really set the stage for feminist approaches to racial justice, we need to understand what we mean by the word racism and different forms of racism, and then also what folks mean by anti-racism or racial justice work. So that's the goal of this quick little narrated PowerPoint, is just to give you a very quick and very fast overview of some different ways of understanding what racism is. And you can see there from a post-it note from a community organizing national gathering that I went to, some, I think, really provocative and basic ways of thinking about what racism is. Others of you have taken a course with me last fall, and you know that we could spend an entire course looking at the content from these slides, and in fact, an entire course probably just digging in on one of these slides. And I'm actually contemplating maybe putting together some kind of online summer course that would look at one of these or two of these ideas from the perspective of COVID-19. All of that is to say, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm just going to be really just basically touching on the surface of it. So anyway, buckle up. There's going to be a lot coming. A lot of this is coming to you via Kemara Phyllis Jones, who is, interestingly enough, out of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She's been there for a very, very long time. Some of these ideas about ways of thinking about racism come from a very long history of her own work in examining the interplay of racial identity and health outcomes, even long before this COVID virus. And she has a number of analogies for thinking about race. I will put a link to an optional TED Talk if you want to see her unpack these a little bit more. But let me give you a couple of her ways of thinking about race. I think the first thing that's very important to underscore here is that race is not a biological reality or a biological descriptor. There's no real biology to race. That race is really a social classification of human beings. It's a social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society, or in a society that pays attention to the physical differences among people. Okay, so race is not a biological reality. It is a social one, and it's a very powerful social one, but it has no real roots in science. There's a couple key ideas that kind of go into the building blocks of racism that work together to create racism. So we just saw the first, that this notion of race not being a biological classification, but rather a social one. So it's a socially constructed idea. And some other things that go into the mix here are bias, prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. And you can see all of those little definitions I offer you of those things. It's important to note that these things in and of themselves are not racism. They are components of race. They're the ingredients of it. So bias is just preferences, and all of us have preferences. It's part of what it means to be human. It's part of what it means to be socialized in our culture. We all prefer some things more than others. And then a lot of us, because of the way that we are raised, because of the cultures that we come up in, because of our exposure in schooling and in our religious traditions and by our media, we create judgments that are rooted in beliefs and attitudes about the preferences that we hold, that we judge certain things or certain people to be better, or to be more valuable, or to be smarter, or to be superior in some way. And those prejudgments, again, are rooted in beliefs and attitudes. And there might not necessarily be anything wrong with them, other than maybe they're not founded in fact or reality. But it's when we act on them, and that's that last bit there, when we act on our prejudices, that they become a problem. And then I think lastly, we could say a piece of this mix is stereotypes, which are widely held, fixed and oversimplified beliefs about groups, whole groups of people. So stereotypes tend to be things that lots of people hold. They tend to be very static or unchanging. The stereotypes we've had about certain groups of people have persisted over time. And they tend to be oversimplified, and we often make them based on the observation of one particular person from one of these social groupings or social classifications of people. Okay, so those are our building blocks of racism. So let's get to a very basic way of thinking about what racism is. And ultimately, racism is really a system of structures. So think back to what we talked about last week in terms of social justice as a way of doing social change that focuses on structures or systems or institutions. Racism is really a system of power structures and structures of opportunity and of value. And so these are power structures that assign opportunity and value based on the social interpretation of how we look. Again, think back to that notion of social representation as another way of thinking about race. So based on racial classification. So I think another thing that's important is it doesn't simply unfairly disadvantage some people, but it also unfairly advantages others. So Phyllis Jones has this really great analogy of thinking about racism in terms of a two-sided sign. You see them in restaurants, let's say, or shops. Most of them are turned to the closed side right now because everybody is, in this quarantine. But in times when we're not in quarantine, you could approach a restaurant and it could have a, yes, we're open, side facing out, and you could be seated by the hostess and sit down, and unbeknownst to you, the restaurant could be closing not long after you sit down, and the sign gets flipped around, and people approaching the restaurant after you've been seated and after that sign has been turned around are experiencing that restaurant in a very different way. They are denied access to that restaurant. They are not given the opportunity to sit down and eat in the restaurant. Folks inside the restaurant might be really oblivious to that happening. Folks on the outside are not. And so if we think about racism in terms of the ways, power structures that assign opportunity and value to people based on a social interpretation of how they look, I think is helpful. So let me give you a couple very specific ways of thinking about different kinds of racism. So interpersonal racism is really when we tend to think about racism, this is what usually comes to mind. This common sense approach to racism, an interaction between two individuals or smaller groups of people where person A consciously does something negative, consciously acts on a prejudice, discriminates against person B based on some kind of racial bias or racial prejudice, right? So when we think about racism, this tends to be how we as Americans tend to think of it, if we do think of it. When we have conversations or when we tend to have a call for conversations or want to intervene or respond, often it's communities trying to respond to these sorts of incidents of interpersonal racism. But the challenge is that really that stays at a very superficial level. It's very real and certainly impacts the people who are involved, but it really does not call our attention to other dimensions of racism. So one dimension of racism that doesn't really get a whole lot of play, but is very significant, is internalized racism. So when we internalize the messages that we get in our society about the value and the power that gets assigned with our racial identity. And that can be both in a positive way or in a negative way. So privileged groups can internalize a sense of superiority. People who identify as white in our culture or who have been raised as white really sort of think of our own experience as being the norm. We assume that everybody's experience is very much like ours, and we're often really unaware of the privileges and the power that we have by virtue of our racial identity. We're the people sitting in the restaurant who really aren't even aware that the owner has flipped the sign and that there's all sorts of people who don't have access to the same things that we do. But also we can be internalizing messages of inferiority as well. So disadvantaged groups are often internalizing messages that they get about their inferiority, their lack, their need, the fact that they are less than on any number of levels, right? And it can create all sorts of internal problems. The second way that we could think here, a more nuanced way of thinking about racism, or not nuanced, but a more accurate way of thinking about racism, is on an institutional level, right? And institutional racism takes place when an institution is shaped and structured in a way where it serves one group of people and is really overly accountable to one group of people, while at the same time not effectively serving or feeling it's accountable or being held accountable to other racial groups. So in education, for example, in higher ed, historically, and some would argue even today, higher education tends to really effectively serve and be accountable largely to white people and largely to middle and upper class whites, and doesn't necessarily hold itself to the same level of accountability or serve in the same way minority groups, families and kids of color, right? So that would be an example of institutional racism. Another way that we could think about racism is just to think about it as a cultural phenomenon, something that's really kind of part of the ethos of what it means to be American. And it's something that pervades absolutely everything about our shared life, particularly as Americans, right? So as a culture, it's something that can be taught, it's something that can be learned, it's something that's conveyed in symbols and stories and beliefs. It's something that's perpetuated by religions. It's something that's perpetuated in our education system. It just permeates everything. It permeates all of our interactions and all of our structures and all of our institutions. It makes it very difficult for us to separate ourselves from racism when we think about it as a cultural reality. And a thinker that has been really significant in bringing that forward, who was supposed to be with us back in March if we had not had the COVID outbreak, and who I had encouraged you to perhaps go and see, is Brian Massengale, Father Brian Massengale. So he's a big proponent of thinking about racism as a cultural phenomenon. A very common way that we often encounter racism is in terms of colorblind racism. And this is often people who identify with the dominant culture, but not necessarily, who just say, well, listen, I don't see color, I don't see race. I don't know why we have to continue to talk about it. I really just see people. I think that the best way that we create a just society is to try to get over this focus on racism and racial difference and really focus on our common humanity and our shared common concerns. And while the intention there is understandable and good, scientists, social scientists, and people who do work in critical race theory say, look, there's a couple problems that come with a colorblind approach to racial justice or to colorblind racism. First, we have to recognize that for many of us, our racial identity is not the only facet of our identity, but it's a big one. And that when we refuse to see people for their difference, we really don't fully see them. And that we might actually just be seeing them through the lens of the dominant culture. And then the second, and I really like that little image there in the bottom right hand, you can't fix something that you refuse to really see, or that you can't see, or that you can't name. That you're not really even able to own or dismantle or take apart some of your own prejudices and maybe even discriminatory practices if you're not able to own your own racial identity and see your own racial identity, much less the way that other people's racial identity impacts the way that they interact with institutions. So we're seeing this a lot in the COVID crisis right now, and you're going to hear more about that in another video. Okay, so a couple more ideas, and then I'm going to wrap up. So often white people experience race in terms of privileges, so benefits that we accrue by virtue of our identity, right? And these benefits can sometimes be called capital, social capital. the different things that we can trade in order to maintain our position in society or to get ahead. Another way that folks talk about racism is in terms of white supremacy. And basically, and I really like this definition, it's pretty clear and pretty succinct. It's a value gap. A way in our society where we just tend to value white people and white institutions and white culture and white thinkers and white gods. The list could go on and on a lot more, right? And that value gap continues to shape the way that we experience life in our country. So I'm going to hit pause, and I've got one more thing that I'm going to add here at the